Hopes to become the next Rudolf Nureyev. But first, the news. Bob?
Thank you, Jordy. The Serb withdrawal of territory near Sarajevo is under intense UN scrutiny today. The United Nations has installed radar on top of Mount Igman, the mountain which the Serbs have promised to vacate this morning. The radar is monitoring troop movements. As well, NATO reconnaissance planes are flying over that area regularly. The Serbs claim that they have pulled their troops out, but the United Nations disputes that. More on the situation from Barry Peterson of CBS News.
The pace of withdrawal. Sarajevo.
The CBC's Anna Maria Tremonti is following this story from Sarajevo, and earlier today we asked her to help sort out some of the confusion surrounding the Serb withdrawal.
Still a city under siege.
The CBC's Anna Maria Tremonti spoke to us earlier today from Sarajevo. International efforts to help victims of the Bosnian War are gaining momentum. External Affairs Minister Perrin Beatty says that Canada will airlift up to 20 patients from Sarajevo. There is no word yet when the evacuation will begin. In Europe, efforts to get injured people out of Sarajevo are already underway. Medical workers left Scotland this morning to help organize a British airlift. Up to 41 of the most seriously wounded people will be moved to Europe for treatment by early next week. The North American Free Trade Agreement appears to have run into some more trouble. There are reports that Mexico and the United States had reached a compromise agreement on side deals, but government sources in Ottawa say that Prime Minister Kim Campbell rejected the proposal. Reports say that Campbell would not agree to propose trade sanctions. The sanctions would be imposed for violations of labor and environmental law. Meanwhile, a Mexican government document says that the talks are at a breaking point. It says that Washington and Ottawa are pushing for the right to sue Mexico if it doesn't comply with environmental safeguards. Officials in Mexico say this is an unacceptable threat to their sovereignty. Audrey McLaughlin tore a page out of President Bill Clinton's strategy book last night. She held a town hall-style television show on a network in Ontario, all part of a push by the federal NDP to get back into the political spotlight. Red Sharon reports.
Audrey McLaughlin.
Increased security in townships to the east of Johannesburg has failed to stop a new wave of violence. Overnight, police opened fire on a crowd of several hundred demonstrators, killing at least 7 people. This morning, thousands of people turned out in another township to bury their dead. Victims of a new and deadly wave of political violence is sweeping the country. The BBC's John Harrison reports from Tembisa.
National weather forecast. Back to Bob, and he'll take us to Florida.
Thanks very much, Jordy. As we said just a moment ago, Space Shuttle Discovery on the pad in Cape Canaveral, Florida, scheduled to lift off in about a minute and a half from now. Let's go to those pictures now. There it is, Discovery on the pad. The crew has been aboard in the cockpit since about 6:15 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. 1 minute there you see on the NASA countdown for Discovery's liftoff. This is the third attempt to get Discovery into orbit. A couple of mechanical failures delayed the flight earlier on in the last couple of weeks, and then just last week, last Sunday, as a matter of fact, the Discovery shuttle launch was delayed because of the Perseid meteor shower that we have been hearing quite a bit about as of late. Some concern there that there may be some debris that could possibly hit the shuttle once it enters space, so they delayed it last Sunday, and this now the third attempt in the last 3 weeks. Let's go live now to NASA Select and their commentary, if we can pick that up, and watch the liftoff of Shuttle Discovery.
Second.
15.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7. Go for main engine start. 3 main engines up and burning. 3. We have a cutoff.
Pass the BFS for 101. LDB shows 1. CTD is SDE. Perform RSLS aboard. CLS station is in progress. I copy. CDR NTD panel 06.
And the main engine cutoff.
CDR NTD panel 06. CTC mode 5.
Safing in work.
That's done. Coming in hood. NTD GLS. If accepted are safe. All three are
Well, obviously there has been a further difficulty with the launch of the Shuttle Discovery. The gantry now being returned to the cockpit door. This, as we said, is another in a series of problems that have plagued the launch of Discovery as you look at some sort of water or perhaps retardant cooling down the main engines of Discovery. There had been a couple of previous mechanical failures with Discovery, and then, as we said, it was delayed last Sunday because of the Perseid meteor shower. Now we're seeing just seconds, literally right down to the last second before Discovery was scheduled to lift off. There was another further problem. We haven't exactly heard what that is yet, but computers did shut the launch down. Discovery still sitting on the pad. Well, we'll keep you posted. We'll let you know as soon as we know what the problem is with the liftoff of Space Shuttle Discovery. Again, just seconds before it was to lift off, that launch was shut down by the computers which control this launch. We'll keep you posted as to why that happened. Right now, we're going to check out more sports, and Jordy has some sports highlights. Well, there are some major problems developing in the North American free trade negotiations, and there are some suggestions that that deal could be in trouble. Mexican, Canadian, and U.S. officials have been negotiating side deals to uphold labor and environmental protection laws. Enforcement of those side deals is causing some disagreement amongst the three parties, though. Yesterday, Prime Minister Kim Campbell vetoed one such proposal. It calls for possible trade sanctions against any NAFTA country that flouts labor or environmental laws. Now, at the same time, the Mexican government is heatedly opposing a proposal that would let Canada and the United States sue Mexico in its own courts for violating environmental laws. Overall, it's been a pretty bad day for supporters of the NAFTA deal. Joining us this morning to talk about the fallout from this is Charles Duran of the Johns Hopkins University, and also with us in Halifax is Alistair Sinclair of Dalhousie University. Both gentlemen are trade analysts. Let's start, if we can, with you in Halifax, Mr. Sinclair, and get you to tell us a little bit more about why Kim Campbell wanted to veto this enforcement plan that would allow for trade sanctions. What's her concern?
Well, I think Canadian concern right along, and this goes back to the free trade agreement as well as NAFTA, is to protect our exports against threats from U.S. manufacturers who put on countervailing duty, dumping charges, and so on. Our posture in this whole thing has been, in a sense, defensive. Mexico is an added problem for us. We're not so much concerned about Mexico. We don't trade that much with it and so on. But we certainly don't want a new restriction coming in which will allow American firms to take action against our exports to them. Mexico is sort of a red herring as far as Canada's concerned on this in terms of Mexican environmental and labor legislation. Well,
what's the concern here, though? I mean, does Canada feel it cannot meet the conditions set out amongst the three parties in terms of environmental and labor standards, that we're not going to be able to meet those standards? Is that the concern?
Well, the concern is that firms and others can raise complaints which cost you a lot of money to show that you are in fact complying with the law. It's a form of harassment. It could be seen as a form of harassment which is very costly to counter. That, I think, is what lies behind the Canadian concern. Not that we're going to run out and advocate a poor environmental or labor legislation, but it's very difficult to prove in these fora that your legislation is in fact consistent with that. It's this old legal problem. How do you prove something?
Mr. Duran, let's go to you in Washington, because I want to get a sense from you as to where you think these negotiations stand, because just a few days ago I think we were reporting, and others were reporting, that it looked like Canada was only going to face fines, that Mexico would be the country that would face trade sanctions if they didn't live up to labor and environmental laws. Now it looks like we also have the possibility of trade sanctions, or was that always there?
Well, I think that the basic concern is that none of the parties want to see firms moving across borders to escape environmental sanctions, and they also want to see firms abiding by some minimal labor standards. The question is, how do you get the wording so that it's narrow enough not to exclude this, but not to include a lot of other things? My own judgment is that they're really not that far apart, and that the term posturing was used. I think there's a little of this because it's important for each government to show that they have gotten the maximum from the others in terms of the domestic audience, and there's a lot of that in place now.
But isn't the concern here with not living up to environmental and labor standards more a concern with Mexico than it is with Canada? And I wonder why Canada isn't being exempt from that, and perhaps allow those laws of enforcement and sanction and fines to be applied to Mexico, which is where the big concern is, and exempt Canada.
Oh, there's no question that Mexico is the one that has the hardest time. It's the poorest country, and so it has the hardest time to put these environmental standards into effect, and particularly to enforce them. I think probably there's also, though, a kind of reciprocity where the Mexican government is saying, well, in theory, in the United States or Canada, in some cases, could have weaker standards, and therefore, why should it all be oriented toward Mexico alone? So it should be applied. These standards should be applied procedures equally.
Now, Mr. Sinclair, you described this process of, border tariffs being sort of the last option that would be put in place after a long, sort of convoluted process, which would cost a lot of money. Give us maybe a hypothetical scenario where a NAFTA partner could face sanctions. How would that process work?
Well, it would probably work the same way that countervailing duty and anti-dumping charges are worked. You bring you bring a complaint. It goes through your system or through a tribunal or through some international system. We've had a lot of experience with this in Canada under the Free Trade Agreement, the tribunals that adjudicate on salmon and on other things. But we've had experience that leads us to believe that innocuous kinds of measures on our part, at least as seen by us, can be seen by others as interfering with trade. Two examples from the 80s that jump to mind are unemployment insurance in the fisheries was regarded as an unfair subsidy. It wasn't upheld, but it took a lot of money to show that. The stumping royalty question with our softwood lumber exports, nobody would have thought that that was against trade practices on a level playing field. So you never know where these things can spring up. It could come up with endangering the habitat of some species that nobody has ever heard of. That could be an environmental one could take environmental action on that ground.
When you look at this latest action by Kim Campbell, then, where she's talking about vetoing these latest proposed changes, could this be a spoiler to the entire deal, do you think, Mr. Sinclair?
Oh, I don't think so. I think there's too much riding on it now. We've gone too far down this track. I don't think Canada was enthused about it to begin with, but I don't think we can bail out now on an issue like this. I believe there is some posturing, as was mentioned, and I think they will come to some agreement on it.
Well, Mr. Doran, as you well know, the U.S. Congress is apparently still, I guess, lukewarm at best to NAFTA. What do you think this latest concern is going to do? Will it discourage lawmakers even more?
Well, what is interesting is that business, by and large, would take here in the United States, would take the position that Prime Minister Campbell is taking, and that is to not have too many kinds of restrictions. But it's other groups here that are very powerful and can affect the passage, which are at issue. I mean, the environmentalists and particularly organized labor. And what is ironic is the politics of this is getting very complicated here, because you have now people on the far right who are against the agreement. We used to think this was something only for the people in labor and the environmentalists. It's not true. So Clinton is having to navigate through, sort of stick-handle through all of this opposition, and it's not easy.
Okay, we'll watch and see what happens here. Mr. Doran, Mr. Sinclair, thank you both very much for being with us on short notice. Still ahead on the CBC Morning News, a Calgary boy who's made it to the elite National Ballet School. Just ahead, we'll have sports with Jordy. The Jays increased their lead to 2 games in the American League East. Paul Molitor hits his 17th homer. And our top story this hour, the United Nations says Serb forces are withdrawing from mountains near Sarajevo, but a sizable number remain. Continued Serb presence has now led to a new warning of NATO airstrikes.
Correct. And our entertainment panel looks at Ted Turner's newest acquisition in Hollywood. But first, our news. Bob?
Thank you, Jordy. The North American Free Trade Agreement seems to have cleared a big stumbling block. Late yesterday, negotiators from Canada, the United States, and Mexico agreed on a series of side deals. Those deals cover the enforcement of labor and environmental laws. Details of those deals will be announced this morning at news briefings in all 3 countries. The breakthrough, though, comes as somewhat of a surprise. Earlier yesterday, Prime Minister Kim Campbell was saying that negotiations were stalled. But the 3 trade ministers spent most of the day negotiating by telephone, and they were able to work out a compromise that's been accepted by all 3 countries. With this hurdle out of the way, the free trade deal can now go to the U.S. Congress for ratification. CBC News has learned that military police are investigating the conduct of one of the most senior Canadian commanders in Somalia. The investigation is into orders issued by the commander of Canada's elite airborne regiment. The military police are looking into the shooting death of a Somali man in early March. Last week, they received search warrants for the office and quarters of Lieutenant Colonel Carol Madu. According to the documents obtained by CBC News, they're investigating whether Mathieu extended the use of deadly force in Somalia beyond the limits which had been set out by headquarters. UN commanders traveled to the mountains overlooking Sarajevo this morning. It's their latest attempt to keep Serbs and Muslims apart. They are meeting with generals from both sides today, trying to arrange the details of a Serbian troop withdrawal and also trying to stabilize